Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ramanaya. Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about Upadēśa Undiyār, but particularly about the fact that the underlying message of Upadēśa Undiyār is that the path to liberation is not doing but being. It's not a karma, but the state of the being as we are. So this is the central theme running throughout Upadēśa Undiyār. In his Payaram, or that is the prefatory verse composed by Murugan, the meaning of the verse is, know that Upadēśa Undiyār is a light of Dhyana that our father Ramana composed and gave to Murugan, who said, for the world to be saved, giving up the delusion of karma, tell the secret of the nature of the path to experience liberation. So this is what Upadēśa Undiyār is about. This verse begins, karma maya attained, giving up the delusion of karma, gati kana nere muriyin, mammam, the secret of the means of the path to attain liberation, ulahuwiya, so that the world may be saved, teach us. So that is what Murugan requested Bhagavan to do. And Bhagavan, in Tamil, he selected 6 verses from the story that Murugan was narrating in Tiruvundiya. And the first 2 verses of that Upagatam, Bhagavan selected these as introductory verses to the whole work. So in the first verse, Daruvanatil tavam saitirundava purva karmatal undipara pokane pohina undipara. That means those who were doing tapas in the Dharaka forest were going to ruin by purva karma. Purva karma in this context, purva means former, but it's referring here to purva mimamsa. That is, so what is meant by purva karma here is the path of karmiya karmas, that is action performed for the fulfillment of desires, as prescribed by the purva, in the purva mimamsa. So that's the first verse, and then the second verse is karma te andri kadavulile ennum vanmata ta ayena undipara vanja serukanal undipara. What that means is, because of delusive conceit, they became intoxicated with intense pride that there is no God except karma. That is the basic belief. Their basic belief was, if you do karma, but karma has to give fruit. And so even if there's no God except karma, karma te andri kadvalile, that was the arrogant belief they had. So Shiva had to come in the form of a mendicant, accompanied by Vishnu in the form of Mohini. And I won't go into the details in the story, but anyway, finally their pride was vanquished and they prayed to be guided on the proper path. So that is the context in which Bhagavan began this Upadēśa Undiyār. That is why in the first verse he says, karmam payantaro kartana danayal, karmam kadavalo undipara, karmam jadamanal undipara. That means action giving fruit is by the ordainment of God. Since action is jada, is action God. That is the belief of Purva Mimamsikas, is that karma will automatically give fruit. They give an analogy. They say, just like in a herd of cows, the calf will always find its mother. Likewise, the fruit of any karma will automatically find its doer. In other words, if we do an action, the fruit will automatically follow us. We will automatically experience the fruit. But that is a fallacious argument, because the calf is a sentient being, so it's able to find its mother. But as Bhagavan says here, karmam jadamadal, karma is jada, it's not aware, it's got no awareness. So how can the fruit of karma find its doer? It cannot. The fruit of karma is given only by God. That's why he says karma giving fruit is by the ordainment of God. So God is the one who allots the appropriate fruit for any action. So if we do an action, the fruit is out of our hands, it's in the hands of God, and God will select the appropriate time to give the appropriate fruit for each action. Of course, we'll never experience all the fruits of all our actions, but God selects, for each life, God selects those fruit which will be most conducive to our spiritual advancement. So whatever we experience is a selection of the fruit of our past karmas, chosen by God and allotted by God for us to experience in this lifetime in such a way that it will be conducive to our spiritual progress. Then in the next verse, he says, Vinayam vilevu vilevutru vittai, vine kadal virtidam undipara, vidu tarile undipara. That means the fruit of action perishing as seed causes to fall in the ocean of action. It does not give liberation. What he means by the fruit of action perishing, that is, any action we do has a corresponding fruit, which is allotted by God. And once we experience the fruit of any action, that fruit is finished. So just like a physical fruit, if we have a mango and eat the mango, we can't eat it a second time. Once we've eaten the mango, it's finished. So in the same way, the fruit of karma perishes. Right? When it's experienced, the fruit is over. But that is not the end of the story, because the fruit, along with the fruit, comes a seed, and it's the seed that causes us to fall in the ocean of action. The seeds, in Tamil, Bhagavan says vittai. In the Malayalam version, he says vasanakara vittai, of seeds in the form of vasanas. So vasanas are the seeds that make us do the same action again and again and again. This is why action is self-perpetuating. So whatever agamya karma we do under the sway of our vasanas. And when we act under the sway of our vasanas, those vasanas are thereby strengthened. So action is self-perpetuating. Therefore, vidu tarale, it does not give liberation. In the Sanskrit version, he says even more firmly, he says gati nirodhakam, it obstructs liberation. Incidentally, in the Sanskrit version, it's very beautiful. Kriti mahodado patanakaranam palamasasvatam gati nirodhakam. What that means is the cause of falling in the vast ocean of action. What is the cause is not specified there. But we can understand from the Tamil and the Malayalam, the cause is the vasanas, the seed. Here in the Sanskrit version, it's left for us to understand. The fruit obviously doesn't make us fall in the ocean of action, because the fruit is palamasasvatam. It's impermanent, because as soon as we experience the fruit, it's over. What causes us to fall, the karanam of kriti mahodano patana karanam, is the vasanas, but under whose sway we do the actions. And gati nirodhakam, it's liberation obstructing. So Bhagavan very clearly says in this verse, action will not give liberation. In fact, it will obstruct liberation. Then if there's nothing that we can do to attain liberation, then does that mean there's no path to liberation? Bhagavan then goes on to say in the next verse that That is, though the karma will not give liberation, he says in the next verse, Kartanu kakam nishkarmiya karmam, karte tiriti aktundi para, gativari kambikum undi para. What that means is, Nishkama Karma, that's action done without desire for the fruit. Then what is the motive for doing it? Done for God, kartanu kakam. So Nishkama Karma, done for God, that implies done for the love of God. And in fact, in the Malayalam version, he says, Ishwara Priti Enai, which means for the love of God. So that desireless action, which is done for the love of God, karate tiriti, purifying the mind, aktu gativari kambikam, it will show the path to liberation. So the nishkarmiya karma is not in itself the path to liberation, but it will purify the mind and show the path to liberation. What does he mean by show the path to liberation? The word for show is kambikam, which it literally means will cause to see. So it will enable us to see what is the path to liberation. Because so long as the mind is pure, the path to liberation will not be clear to us. But the more the mind is purified, the clearer it will become to us what is the path to liberation. That is, by purifying the mind, we gain the clarity to understand what is the path to liberation. What is the path to liberation? He explains further on. In the similar way, he says in the Sanskrit, Ishwara pitam nechaya kritam chitta sodakam mukti sadakam. Offered to God, not done with desire, mind purifier, liberation accomplishing. That implies the action that is not done with desire, but offered to God, is a mind purifier. It will purify the mind. And here he says, mukti sadakam, that is, it is liberation accomplishing. That doesn't mean that it is a direct path to liberation, as he makes clear in the Tamil. In Tamil, he says it will show the way to liberation, but indirectly, it's a means to liberation, but it's not the final path. And then in the next series of verses, he begins to talk about what are the nishkarmiya karmas we can do. One important thing to note here, Bhagavan doesn't take, that is very, traditionally there is said to be four paths: the path of karma, meaning nishkarmiya karma, the path of bhakti, the path of yoga, meaning ashtanga yoga, and the path of jnana, which is the path of self-investigation. But Bhagavan doesn't take nishkarmiya karma to be a separate path. Because in the previous verse, he says, nishkarmiya karma, kartanu kakam nishkarmiya karma. That is the desirous action done for God, done for the love of God. So the path of nishkarmiya karma is a part of the path of bhakti. That is, the path of bhakti is a path of love for God. We begin by expressing our love for God through action, through actions of mind, speech, and body. But the actions we do by, but it actually is the other order, by body, speech, and mind. So the actions we do to express our love for God by body are called puja. The actions we do by speech to express our love for God are called japa. And the action we do by mind is called dhyana. So in this fourth verse, he says, Didumidu pujai japamum dhyanam udulva ulla toril undipara vivu ahum ondru undipara. What that means is, didumidu, this is certain. Puja, japa, and dhyana are actions of body, speech, and mind, respectively. Respectively is not there, but it's obviously it's implied. And then Virvu Ahum Ondril Ondru. That means one than one is superior. What that implies is each one of these is superior to the previous one. So better than puja is japa, better than japa is dhyana. When he says virvu, superior, what he means is more efficacious in purifying the mind. Because the aim of all these is to purify the mind. That is the benefit to be gained by Nishkama Karma, done for the love of God, is the purification of the mind. So in purifying the mind, more effective than puja is japa. More effective than japa is dhyana. That is the implication of this verse. Then he goes through the next 4 verses, he goes through each of these in turn. In verse 5, he talks about puja, which he gives a very broad definition of it, saying, Enuru yavam ireyuru amena, eni vari padal undipara, isan nalpusane undipara. Worshipping, thinking that all 8 forms of God is good worship of God. All the 8 forms means the 5 elements, the sun, moon, and jiva. So it implies the whole manifest universe. All is a form of God. So if we consider everything to be a form of God and worship accordingly, it's good worship of God. That gives us, so the worship isn't just limited to ritualistic worship. We can worship God in so many ways. If we have this attitude, but take the whole world to be God and all the jivas in it to be forms of God, that is good worship of God. And then he talks about japa and he talks about dhyana. I won't go into these. These are all Nishkama Karma. So Nishkama Puja, Nishkama Japa, and Nishkama Dhyana. He's not talking here about most people who do puja, japa, and dhyana will do it for some benefit. But if we're doing it not for any benefit, but just for the love of God, then it is nishkamya. So up to verse 7, he's talking about actions, the actions of the body, which are puja, the actions of the nishkamya action, that is, the nishkamya puja, nishkamya japa, and nishkamya dhyana. But then in verse 8, it is an important turning point. That is, up to verse 7 is all the path of Nishkama Karma. So long as we are meditating on God or worshipping God as something other than ourselves, in other words, so long as we're worshipping God in name and form, that action of speech, of body, speech, or mind, it's a doing, it's an action, it's a karma. So if we're meditating on God in name and form, our attention is going away from ourselves towards that name and form of God. That is very efficacious at purifying the mind, but it is not in itself the path to liberation. The important turning point comes in verse 8. In verse 8, what he says is, Anya bhavatin avanahamahum ananya bhavame undipara anatinum utumum undipara. That means rather than anya bhava, ananya bhava, in which he is I, is certainly the best among all. So what does this mean? Anya means what is other. Ananya means what is not other. So in this context, anya bhava implies meditating on God as something other than ourselves. In other words, meditating on God in name and form. Whereas ananya bhava means meditating on God as not other, implying not other than ourselves. Ananya, and he qualifies it as avanahamahum, in which he is I. So what that implies is, with the understanding that God is what is shining in our heart as I, meditating on nothing other than I, in other words, meditating on nothing other than ourselves, that is certainly the best among all, anatinum utumum. So Bhagavan acknowledges the efficacy of anya bhava, that is meditating on God as something other than ourselves, but more efficacious in purifying the mind than anya bhava is ananya bhava. meditating on God as not other than ourself means meditating on ourself alone. So what he describes here as avanahamahum ananya bhava in which he is I, is the practice of self-investigation. In other words, meditating on ourself alone. What he refers to in Nana as Atma-vichara or Swarupa Dhyana, meditating only on ourself, meditating on nothing other than ourself. Because once we understand that he is I, what is the most direct way to meditate on him? To meditate on him as I. So this is Bhagavan is showing here how the path of bhakti leads to the path of vichara. So long as we're meditating on God as something other than ourselves, that is an action. But when we meditate upon God as nothing other than ourselves, in other words, when we meditate on ourself alone, the nature of ego, as Bhagavan clarified in so many ways, in so many places and in so many ways, the nature of ego is that the ego cannot rise, stand, or flourish without grasping form, as he says in verse 25 of Upadēśa. Grasping form means grasping things other than itself. In other words, attending to things other than ourselves is the food on which this mind lives. That is when, as soon as we rise as ego, we first project and grasp the form of a body as I. And we cannot remain for a moment as ego without constantly holding on to that body as I. That's why he says, Urupatri undam, grasping form, it comes into being. Urupatri nekum, grasping form, it stands. But we don't just grasp this body as I. Having grasped this body as I, we then constantly attending to things other than ourselves, which is what he means by form. Because ego itself has no form of its own. But he describes it as a formless demon. Uruvatra Peyahande, the formless demon ego. So it's got no form of its own, so it has no separate existence of its own. Only by identifying itself with the form of a body does it seem to have a separate existence. And having grasped the form of a body as I, it is then constantly grasping other forms, other phenomena, by attending to them. So that is he says, Urupatri undu mika ongam, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Uruvittu urupatram, leaving form, it grasps form. So the nature of ego is to constantly grasp things other than itself. But if instead of grasping things other than itself, if it tries to grasp itself, what happens? Tedinal otum pidicum. That literally means if seeking, it takes flight. What that implies, if ego seeks its own reality, if it seeks to know who am I, it will take flight. That's a metaphorical way of saying it will subside and dissolve back into its source. So what he reveals in that verse 25 of Upadēśa and in so many other places is that the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to things other than itself, but to subside by attending to itself. So what he refers to here as ananya bhava is attending to ourself alone, attending to nothing other than ourselves. When we attend to nothing other than ourselves, we as ego subside. So it's meditating on anything other than ourselves is an action, whereas the meditating on ourselves is a cessation of action, because it's a cessation of the doer of action, namely ego. So in the next verse, verse 9, he says, Bhava balatinal bhavanatita sa bhava terutale undipara parabakti tattvam undipara. What that means is bhava balatinal means by the strength of meditation. What meditation? The implication is by the strength of that ananya bhava. In other words, by the strength of self-attentiveness, by the strength of swarupa dhyana. Bhavanatita sat bhavatu iritale. Iritale means just being. Sat bhavatu means in the state of being. So by the strength of that self-attentiveness, being in Sat-bhava, being in the state of being, which transcends bhavana, is Parabakti Tattva. That alone is Parabakti Tattva. Transcending bhavana, here bhavana means meditation in the form of mental activity. So if we're meditating on anything other than ourselves, that's a mental activity. Whereas if we meditate on ourselves, we will subside and remain in the state of being. That's what he implies here. So by Ananya Bhava, by meditating just on ourselves, by the strength of that Ananya Bhava, we will subside and remain in the state of just being. And that is which transcends bhavana in the sense of mental activity. That is the Parabakti Tattva. That is the nature of a truth of supreme devotion. So he begins the path of devotion with Nishkama Karma, Nishkama Puja, Nishkama Japa, and Nishkama Dhyana. But then he shows how by switching from Anya Bhava to Ananya Bhava, it goes from being an action to being just being. And this being is the path to liberation, as he makes clear in this verse and throughout Upadēśa Undiyār. I mean, that's the underlying theme of Upadēśa Undiyār, is that the path to liberation is not doing, but just being. And how to just be, how to be in Sat-bhava, only by the strength of Ananya Bhava, by firm and steady self-attentiveness, we will subside and remain in the state of being. And that, he doesn't say it explicitly, but the implication is that is the path to liberation. So by Nishkama, Puja, Japa, and Dhyana, the mind is purified. And the purified mind comes to recognize that God cannot be something other than ourselves. If God was something other than ourselves, he would be a limited God, because there would be God plus us. So God, the fact that if we exist as something separate from God, then God is thereby limited. But since God is the infinite whole, he cannot be something other than us. So by when the mind is purified, we get that clarity to understand that God is not something other than ourselves. God is our own reality. So in order to know God as he is, we need to know ourselves as we are. And for that, the path of self-investigation, or Ananya Bhava, as he says there in the previous verse. So by that Ananya Bhava, we thereby subside and remain in the Sat-bhava, the state of being. And being in that state of being is, that alone is the supreme devotion. So the path of bhakti begins with Nishkama Karma, and it ends with Atma-vichara, which leads to the state of just being as we actually are. So being in Sat-bhava means being without rising as ego. In order to be without rising as ego, we need it. The means is self-attentiveness, or Atma-vichara, self-investigation. And then he summarizes it all in verse 10 very beautifully. Udita idatil odungi irital adu karmamum bhaktium undipara adu yogamum jnanamum undipara adu yogam jnanamum undipara. What that means is udita idatil odungi. That means subsiding in the place from which one rose. Or in this case, we can take it as having subsided in the place from which one rose, iratal, being. So being, having subsided in the place from which we rose, in other words, ceasing to rise as ego and just being as we actually are, that is karma and bhakti, that is yoga and jnana. That is, it is karma. Karma here means Nishkama Karma, because it's the culmination of Nishkama Karma. Where does Nishkama Karma lead? Ultimately leads to that state of just being as we are, without rising, that is having subsided in the place from which we rose. how the Nishkama Karma leads to this is explained in the previous verse. It's also bhakti, because Nishkama Karma is just the preliminary stages of the path of bhakti are Nishkama Karma. The more advanced stage is the practice of self-investigation, which is not doing, but just being. It is also yoga, because this is the culmination of the path of yoga, where the path of yoga ultimately leads. And it is jnana. It is the state of just, I mean, jnana means real knowledge or pure awareness. That is what we actually are. So it's all these four paths. As he also says beautifully in verse, he says it in another way, but the implication is the same. In verse 14 of Uladunapdu Anubandham, he says, Vinayam vibhakti viyogam ajnanam inaya veyarku endru eindidale vinay bhakti yoga unavu eindida nan indri ave endrum indram aham I think Indru tan tanaha manale unmayam. What that means is investigating to whom are such like karma, vibhakti, viyoga, and ajnana. That is all the karma here means the kamya karma. Vibhakti means the lack of devotion in this context. Usually vibhakti means separation, but in this context it implies lack of devotion or separation from God. Viyoga also means separation, and ajnana, ignorance. To whom are all these? Investigating that is itself karma, bhakti, yoga, and jnana. So all these four paths are contained in this simple investigation. To whom are all these defects? Karma, bhakti, yoga, karma, vibhakti, viyoga, and ajnana. And when one investigates, aindira means when one investigates, nan indri ave indrum il. Without I, they never exist. So all these, the defects that each of these paths seek to overcome, all those defects exist only because we've risen as ego. But if we investigate ourselves, this ego will subside, and therefore all these defects will come to an end. And then he ends by saying, Tanaha manale unmayam. Manale means being permanently. So being permanently as oneself, being as we actually are forever, that is what is true. So we are always what we actually are. The whole problem is that we seem to have risen as ego. If we investigate to whom do all these problems arise, they arise only for I. And when one investigates, that I ceases to exist, and therefore they all cease to exist. So this path of self-investigation taught by Bhagavan it includes all the four paths within it. So having talked about these, the path of Nishkama Karma and bhakti up to verse 9, and summarizing everything in verse 10, then he goes on to talk about the path of yoga. Whenever Bhagavan talks about the path of yoga, yoga in this context means Ashtanga yoga, he talks primarily about pranayama. Why is this? Some people ask, there's more to Ashtanga yoga than just pranayama. Pranayama is just one of the 8 limbs of Ashtanga yoga. So why does Bhagavan select to only talk about pranayama? The reason is the 8 limbs of yoga, most of those 8 limbs are implicit in other paths. For example, the first 2 limbs are yamas and niyamas. All spiritual paths are based on yamas and niyamas. Yamas are things that we need to avoid, and niyamas are things that we need to do, basically. I mean, it's not so simple as that, but yamas and niyamas, they're basic principles of ahimsa and all these principles, which we have to follow if we're following any spiritual path. So that they're not unique to yoga. Asana, that's the third of the 8 limbs. What Patanjali says about asanas is just simple common sense. If you want to sit for a long time in meditation, you need to sit comfortably and in a relaxed way. So Patanjali doesn't go into details of what asanas we should sit in. He simply says we should sit comfortably. Then the 4th one is pranayama. That is what is unique to yoga. And then the final 4, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, these are also common to any practice of meditation. Pratyahara means withdrawal. That is, in order to fix our mind on one thing, we need to withdraw it from other things. Dharana means focusing. So we need to focus on the dhyana lakshya. Whatever object we're meditating on, we need to focus on that. And doing so, that is dhyana, and that leads to samadhi. That is the same in any path if you're on the path of bhakti, you want to fix your mind on God. So you have to withdraw your mind from all other things. You stop thinking about worldly things. You try to think only about God. So you try to focus your mind on God. That is dhyana, and that leads to the deep absorption in that dhyana is samadhi. So this is common to all paths. It's also in the path of self-investigation. We need to fix our attention on ourself. In order to fix our attention on ourself, we need to withdraw it from other things. So the pratyahara and dharana is implied there. And fixing our attention on ourselves is dhyana, and that leads to total absorption, which is samadhi. So all these 8 limbs are, 7 of these 8 limbs are implicit in all others, in most other spiritual paths. What is unique about yoga is that they have this, is the use they make of pranayama. So that is what Bhagavan talks about in when he talks about whenever he takes up the subject of yoga, he talks about pranayama. So in verses 10 and 11, he explains that in verse 10 he says, sorry, verses 11 and 12, sorry, I'm getting confused. In verse 10 he says, when one restrains the breath within, like a bird caught in a net, the mind will also be restrained. This is a means to restrain. So by restraining the breath, we also restrain the mind. So by subduing the activity of the breath, we also subdue the activity of the mind. So this is a technique for subduing mental activity. And how does this work? He explains in verse 12. But mind and breath are 2 branches which have knowing and doing. Mind and breath are 2 branches which have knowing and doing. That is, the function of the mind is knowing. The function of prana is doing. So, but these 2, though they are 2 branches, their root is one. He explains this very nicely in Nana. In Nana, in the 8th paragraph, he explains the efficacy of pranayama, but also the limitation of pranayama. What he says in the 8th paragraph is, manama adanguvadaku vicharanaye tavira verituhunta upayangal ille. That means for the mind to subside or cease, except vicharana, except self-investigation, there is no other adequate means. I'll read just the English meaning rather than the Tamil. If made to subside by other means, the mind will remain as if it had subsided. A dangi pole, he says, how to say it, a dangi Matru Pangalam Adanginal, Manam Adangi Polirandu, being as if subsided, Marupadium Kalambividum, it will, having been having remained as if it is subsided, it will start again. It will rise again. So in other words, if you use other means to bring the mind to a state of stillness, if to bring a stop to the mental activity, it will be temporary. But as soon as the means is released, the mind will rise again. And then he says, even by pranayama, the mind will subside. However, so long as the prana remains subsided, the mind will also remain subsided. And when the prana emerges, it, meaning the mind, will also emerge and wander under the sway of its vasanas. And then he goes on to explain why the pranayama is a means to subdue the activity of the mind. The birthplace for the mind and for prana is one. Thought alone is the swarupa, the nature of the mind. The thought called I is the first thought of the mind. It alone is ego. So the essence of the mind is ego. That of all the thoughts of the mind, the essential thought is ego, as he says later, as he says in verse 18 of Upadēśa Undiyār. From where ego rises, from there alone the breath also rises. Therefore, when the mind ceases, the breath also ceases. And when the prana ceases, when the mind ceases, the prana ceases. And when the prana ceases, the mind also ceases. The prana is called the gross form of the mind. Until the time of death, the mind keeps the prana in the body, and at the moment the body dies, grasping it, it goes. That is, grasping the breath, the mind takes it with it. That's a metaphorical way of saying the mind, the prana will always be accompanied, will always accompany the mind. Of course, we don't take the physical breath. What it means here is that that inclination to breathe, to live in a body, that it goes along with the mind in seed form as a vasana. So when we take another body, it manifests again in the form of all the physiological functions of the body, including breathing. And then he concludes that paragraph by saying, therefore, pranayama is just an aid to restrain the mind, but will not bring about manonasa, annihilation of the mind. In other words, it can bring about a temporary cessation of mind, but not permanent cessation of mind. So that connects us back to what he says in the next verse, verse 13 of Upadēśa Undiyār, where he says, that is, he says, ileamum nasamum irendum odicum, ilea tu ulludu erum undipara, eradu uru mindedel undipara. What that means is dissolution is of two kinds. That implies dissolution of the mind. Dissolution or subsidence of the mind is of two kinds, laya and nasa. So what's the difference between laya and nasa? What is in laya will rise. If its form dies, implying if it attains nasa, it will not rise. So in other words, laya is a temporary dissolution of mind. Nasa is permanent dissolution of mind. So our aim in this spiritual path is permanent dissolution, the nasa. But pranayama cannot bring about nasa. It can only bring about laya. That the most you can achieve by pranayama is laya. So then what is the yogi to do? How is the yogi to since the main technique is pranayama, but pranayama can only bring about a temporary stillness of mind, how is the yogi to attain liberation? That is what Bhagavan points out in the next verse. Odaka valiye odungum ulate vidakave ovari undipara vium adun uru undipara. So what he says here, only when one sends the mind, which will be restrained when one restrains the breath, on the ovari will its form perish. That is, the mind will be restrained when one restrains the breath, but that's not the end of the story. How to bring about the destruction of the mind? Only by sending it on the ovari. So what is this ovari? There are two ways of interpreting ovari. Or can be taken to mean oru, meaning one. So the one path, or also means orum. Or is a verb in Tamil that means to investigate or know. So ovari also means orumvari. Orumvari is the path of investigation. In other words, the path of self-investigation. Even if we take it in the other sense, the one path, what is the one path that will bring about the destruction of the mind? As he says in the first sentence of that 8th paragraph of Nana, there's no adequate means to bring about the cessation of mind, in other words, the permanent cessation of mind, other than Atma-vichara. So ovari here implies Atma-vichara. So only when we send the mind on the path of Atma-vichara will its form die. The same is implied in Sanskrit. Pranabandhana lina manasam ekachintana ekachintanat nasam etiada nasam etiaha. I'm not very good at pronouncing. So what that means is, settled down by restraining the breath, the mind will reach annihilation by ekachintana. So what does ekachintana mean? Superficially, we can take it to mean one thought, but Bhagavan here doesn't mean any one thought. What ekachintana actually means is, just like Atma-chintana means thought of oneself, in other words, meditating on oneself, ekachintana means thought of the one. What is that one? The one without a second, in other words, ourself. We are the one thing that actually exists. So ekachintana is an indirect way of saying Atma-chintana, meditating on ourself alone. That is how the mind will die. Once the mind dies, all activity comes to an end. So here also, Bhagavan implies that the yoga can reach its fruition only by means of Atma-vichara. Just like the bhakti can reach its fruition only by the Atma-vichara, which he refers to there as Ananya Bhava. Here he refers to it as ekachintana or vari. All these are referring to the path of self-investigation. And as I explained earlier, when we attain to ourself, we as ego subside and remain in the place from which we rose, remain in our state of being, Satbhava. So he then concludes this series of verses on yoga by saying, Manovuru maye me mannam ma yogi, tanako selile undipara, Tanil Sandanan Undipara. That means when the form of the mind is annihilated, for the great yogi who remains permanently as the reality, Me Mannam Ma Yogi, a great yogi who remains permanently as the reality, Tanako Seilile, there is not anything, there's not a single doing, there's nothing to do. Because when we subside in the state of being, by means of self-investigation, we thereby remain as the reality, and the reality is just being, not doing. So there's no doing in that state. Tanil Sandanan, he has attained his nature. So in these first 15 verses, Bhagavan has explained how the path of karma, bhakti, and yoga all lead to the state of just being as we actually are, which is alone the means to liberation. Then I was hoping to be able to deal with the last 15 verses in more detail, but I've only got a few minutes remaining. In verse 16, he gives a beautiful description of that. Verse 16 is both a description of the path and the goal. What he says in verse 16 is, Veli videngale vittu manam tan oliuru ordale undipara, unmei unichiam undipara. What that means is, Veli videngale vittu. That means leaving or letting go of external phenomena. That is what in yoga is called pratyahara. We first need to withdraw our mind from everything else. But actually, that is not, we don't need to separately withdraw our mind from everything else. If we fix our mind on ourself, we are thereby automatically withdrawing it from everything else. But so long as we're attending to anything other than ourselves, we cannot fix all our attention on ourselves. In order to fix all our attention on ourselves, to attend to ourselves exclusively, we need to withdraw it from everything else. But by fixing our attention on ourselves, we are thereby automatically withdrawing it from ourselves. So in this sentence, Veli videngale vittu is an adverbial clause. The subject is manam tan oli uru ordale, the mind knowing its form of light. Its form of light means its fundamental awareness. It's that is the essential form of the mind, is the pure awareness I am. So the mind knowing that form of light, the verb ordale, this is the same verb Bhagavan in verse 14, when he said or vari. Or is a Tamil verb that means both investigating and knowing. So we can take this either as the mind investigating its form of light, leaving external thing for vishayas, phenomena, the mind investigating its form of light, that is unmeyunichi, real awareness, or the mind knowing. That is, we cannot know our form of light without investigating it. Investigating it means attending to it. And when we attend to it keenly enough, we thereby know it as it actually is. But the form of light, the mind cannot know the form of light as an object. The mind cannot know pure awareness as an object. What knows pure awareness is only pure awareness. So the mind can know pure awareness only by being pure awareness. So when he says the mind knowing its own form of light, what he means is, as soon as we turn our attention within to know who am I, if we turn it within deep enough, we thereby cease to rise as ego, and we merge back into the pure awareness that we actually are. So just being ourselves is knowing ourselves, as he later says in verse 26. There were many other things I wanted to talk about, but I have hardly left myself time. In verse 26, he says, Tanai iritale tanne aridalam. Being oneself alone is knowing oneself. Tanya rendatradal, because oneself is not two. That is, there's not one self to know another self as an object. We can know ourselves as we actually are only by being what we actually are. So in this verse 16, when he said the mind knowing its own form of light is pure awareness, we can know pure awareness only by being pure awareness. So as soon as the mind or ego knows that pure awareness, or knows itself as pure awareness, it thereby ceases to be mind or ego and remains as pure awareness. So that's why Bhagavan said this is unmayunichi. This alone is real awareness. And then in the next verse, he says, he expresses it beautifully also in Sanskrit. Drisya varitum chittamatmanaha Chitva darshanam, tattva darshanam. Drisya varitam, drisya means what is seen. In other words, all phenomena, objects of perception, everything that is known. So drisya varitam, kept back from that. That is the very vitu, letting go of these external things, withdrawing the mind from these external things. That's a pratyahara. Then chittam atmanaha chitva darshanam. Chittam means the mind. Atmanaha here means its own. That is here. This is the genitive case. The seventh case, I think, of Atmanaha means its own, mind's own. Chitva. Chitva means its nature of awareness. Darshanam. So the mind seeing its own nature of its own awareness nature, we can say, is seeing tattva, is tattva darshanam. Why? Because that our real nature, which is pure awareness, that itself is tattva, that itself is the reality. So if we see our own nature as pure awareness, that itself is seeing the reality. I'm sorry, I'm not able to I mean, there's a lot more to discuss on this subject, but the central point is, throughout Upadēśa Undiyār, the underlying theme is that liberation is attained not by doing, but just by being. And in order to just be, we need to withdraw our attention from all other things and focus it on ourselves. To the extent to which our attention is fixed on ourselves, we as ego thereby subside and remain in Satbhava, which transcends bhavana, transcends all mental activity, and that is Parabakti Tattva, that is the path to liberation. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Arunachala Ashrama.